They say a mother can survive anything, but no one ever mentions what it costs to survive everything at once. The first time I realized I might not make it through another week, I was standing behind a greasy diner counter at 5:40 in the morning, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold a coffee pot steady. My name is Emily Carter, and by the time the sun rises over Chicago, I have already lived 3 different lives in a single day. At dawn, I work at the diner where tired truck drivers barely look up when they order cheap coffee and eggs. By midday, I am scrubbing office floors in a glass building downtown where people in expensive suits step over me without noticing I am even there. By night, I deliver food across dark streets that feel longer every day, my worn-out shoes hitting pavement that never seems to end. I do all of it for my son, Noah, who is 7 years old and believes his mother is strong enough to fix anything in the world. I have never told him how often I feel like I am breaking instead. That morning started like every other morning. The diner smelled like burnt toast and old oil, and my manager was already reminding me that I was late even though I had arrived 10 minutes early. I smiled anyway because smiling costs nothing, and in my world, nothing is more valuable than free. Between orders, I checked my phone just to make sure there were no messages from Noah's school. His cough had been getting worse for days, but I kept telling myself it was just a seasonal cold. I could not afford anything else. By noon, my knees were already aching as I knelt on cold marble floors inside a corporate office building. The silence there was different from the diner. No one yelled. No one noticed. That almost felt worse. I moved through rows of empty desks, wiping surfaces that would be dirty again before anyone even arrived the next morning. At exactly 3 in the afternoon, I received a call from Noah's school. My hands froze the moment I saw the number. The nurse's voice on the other end was polite but serious. She said Noah had been coughing more frequently and might need medical attention soon. I thanked her, hung up, and pressed my forehead against the cold wall of the hallway so no one could see my face fall apart for even a second. I told myself I would handle it after my last job. I had to. By the time night came, I was already running late for my food delivery shift. The city lights blurred as I rode my old bicycle through traffic that never seemed to slow down for anyone. My phone buzzed again halfway through a delivery route, but I ignored it because every minute mattered. Every dollar mattered more than my fear. That was when my body finally stopped pretending it could keep up. It happened inside the loading area of a small restaurant just outside downtown. I remember trying to lift a heavy crate, feeling my vision blur, and then the sound of everything around me fading as if the world had suddenly turned far away. My legs gave out before I could reach the wall. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was thinking that I could not afford to stop, even for a second, because my son was waiting for me at home, and there was no one else in the world who would come if I did not. When I opened my eyes again, the first thing I felt was cold tile beneath my cheek and the distant sound of someone calling my name. For a moment, I did not understand where I was or how long I had been gone. The world felt like it was slowly pulling itself back into focus, piece by piece, like a broken picture trying to rebuild itself. Then reality returned all at once. I was lying on the floor of the restaurant loading area, my body weak, my arms trembling as I tried to push myself up. A man in a delivery uniform knelt beside me, his voice urgent but controlled as he asked if I could hear him. I nodded slightly, though my head felt heavy. My first thought was not about myself. It was about Noah. I tried to sit up faster than my body allowed, panic rising in my chest. I needed to finish my shift. I needed to get home. I needed to make sure my son was okay. But my body refused to obey me. The man gently told me an ambulance had already been called, but I immediately shook my head. I could not afford an ambulance. I could not afford anything that was not absolutely necessary. I tried to stand, but my legs gave out again almost instantly. The delivery worker frowned, clearly unsure what to do, and said quietly that I looked like I had been pushing myself too hard for too long. He was not wrong. Before I could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted everything. A second later, a black car pulled into the loading area where vehicles were not usually allowed to stop. It was long, polished, and completely out of place in a space meant for delivery trucks and workers like me. The engine cut off, and for a brief moment, everything became silent except for the hum of distant city noise. The back door opened, and a man stepped out. He was dressed in a dark tailored coat, his presence calm but commanding in a way that made even the air feel different. I did not know who he was at first. I only noticed that everyone around me seemed to straighten without realizing it. The delivery worker next to me immediately stood up, lowering his head slightly, as if recognizing someone important. The man walked closer, his eyes scanning the situation with quiet precision before stopping directly in front of me. I remember feeling suddenly very small, not because of fear, but because of how completely out of place I felt in his world. He crouched down slightly so that we were at the same level. His voice was calm when he spoke, asking if I could understand him. I nodded again, still trying to steady my breathing. For some reason, I could not look away from his face. There was no anger there, no judgment, only a focused kind of attention I was not used to receiving from anyone. He asked my name. I answered softly. Then he asked where I was supposed to go. I told him home, even though I knew I could barely stand, let alone travel anywhere. Something shifted in his expression at that answer, subtle but noticeable. He looked at my worn delivery bag on the ground, then at my hands, and finally at my face. There was a long silence before he stood up and gave a simple instruction to the delivery worker beside him. I did not fully understand what he said, but I saw the worker quickly move to help me sit more comfortably. The man in the dark coat did not leave. He remained there, watching for a moment longer as if deciding something important. And in that strange, quiet pause, I had no idea that the man standing in front of me was about to change the direction of my entire life in a way I could not yet begin to imagine. The moment he turned away from me, I thought he would leave like everyone else had always done in my life. People usually came close enough to notice my suffering, then disappeared once it became inconvenient. But he did not leave. Instead, he stood a few steps away, speaking quietly on a phone I had not even seen him take out. His voice was calm, controlled, and unfamiliar in a place like this loading dock where everything usually felt rushed and disposable. I could not hear the full conversation, but I caught fragments of words that sounded like instructions rather than requests. Within minutes, something unexpected happened. A second vehicle arrived, followed by another. People in clean uniforms stepped out quickly, moving with purpose instead of confusion. One of them approached me with a medical bag and gently checked my pulse, while another asked the delivery worker questions about what had happened. I kept insisting I was fine, that I only needed a moment to recover, and then I could go back to work, but no one listened to that part. The man in the dark coat returned to my side after finishing his call. He looked down at me for a moment before speaking in a tone that was neither commanding nor distant, but steady in a way that made it impossible to ignore. He asked again where I lived. I hesitated before answering because I knew what came next. If I said the truth, it would lead to questions I could not afford to answer. I told him the address of my small apartment anyway. He nodded once as if that was all he needed to know. The medical staff insisted I be taken somewhere to be properly checked, and before I could argue further, I realized I was being helped carefully into a vehicle. My protests grew weaker as my strength faded. I remember thinking of Noah again, picturing him waiting at home with his small backpack, unaware that his mother was lying in the back of a vehicle she could never have afforded on her own. The ride was silent except for the low hum of the engine and the occasional quiet exchange between the staff outside. I did not understand where I was being taken, only that it was not a hospital I recognized. When we arrived, I was helped inside a building that looked nothing like the places I was used to. Everything was too clean, too quiet, too structured. There were no crowded waiting rooms or tired voices echoing through hallways. Instead, there were wide corridors, soft lighting, and people who moved with calm efficiency. I kept trying to ask questions, but my voice barely came out above a whisper. The man in the dark coat walked beside me the entire time, never rushing ahead, never leaving me behind. At one point, I finally gathered enough strength to ask him why he was doing this. He paused, as if the answer was not simple enough to say quickly. Then he told me something I did not fully understand at first. He said he was only making sure I reached a place where no one would collapse from exhaustion again without anyone noticing. I did not know how to respond to that. No one had ever spoken about my exhaustion as something worth preventing. In my world, exhaustion was simply part of survival. As I was guided into a room where I was told I could rest, I noticed something that made me stop thinking about myself for a moment. On a nearby desk, there was a file with my name written on it. I had never seen it before. I did not know how it got there or who had prepared it. The man in the dark coat noticed my confusion and quietly told me not to worry about it for now. He said the only thing I needed to do was rest. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I was not being told to keep moving, keep working, or keep surviving. And as my eyes finally began to close, I realized I still did not know who he truly was. Only that the world I had lived in yesterday no longer felt like the world I was in today. When I woke again, the first thing I noticed was silence. Not the exhausting kind I had grown used to in cheap apartments or crowded workplaces, but a soft, controlled silence that felt almost unreal. The room I was in was brighter than anything I had seen in years, with pale light filtering through large windows and clean white walls that made it difficult to believe I still belonged in it. For a moment, I simply lay there, trying to remember how I had arrived. Then the memories returned in fragments. The loading dock, the collapse, the man in the dark coat. I slowly turned my head and saw a glass of water placed neatly beside the bed. A chair stood nearby, and in it sat the same man who had brought me here. He was not on the phone this time. He was simply watching the window, as if waiting for me to wake up without any urgency at all. When he noticed I was awake, he stood up and approached slowly, stopping at a respectful distance. He asked if I was in pain. I hesitated before answering honestly that I was only tired. He nodded, as if that was enough information for now. I gathered enough strength to sit up, pulling the thin blanket closer around me. My thoughts immediately went to Noah again, and I asked the question I had been holding in my chest since I first lost consciousness. Where was my son? The man did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached for a folder on the nearby table and placed it gently in front of me. My name was printed on the cover again, clearly and professionally, as though it had always belonged there. He told me that my son was safe and being cared for. The words should have brought instant relief, but instead they filled me with confusion. I did not understand how he could know that, or why he would be involved in something so personal. I opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were pages of medical information, school records, and details about Noah that I had never shared with anyone outside of official forms. My breathing became uneven as I realized how much information was there, organized and complete, as if someone had been quietly building a safety net around my life without my knowledge. I looked up at him, unable to hide my shock. He remained calm, as if this level of intrusion into my life was simply part of a larger process. I asked him again who he was, this time more firmly. He did not answer directly. Instead, he walked to the window and looked out for a long moment before speaking. He said that names and titles did not matter at this point. What mattered was that I and my son would no longer continue living the way we had been living before. I felt a wave of fear rise inside me. People did not simply appear in your life, gather information about your child, and move you into unfamiliar buildings without reason. I told him I could not accept help I did not understand. He turned back toward me and said something that stayed with me longer than anything else that day. He said that understanding often came after safety, not before it. The idea felt impossible to accept. In my world, nothing came before survival. And yet, as I looked around the quiet room and thought about Noah sleeping somewhere safe for the first time in weeks, I realized I had already crossed into a place where my old rules no longer applied. And the only thing I knew for certain was that the man in front of me had not come into my life by accident. The following morning, I woke up to the sound of distant footsteps outside the room and the soft hum of a building that never seemed to sleep. For a brief moment, I forgot where I was. Then everything came rushing back in quiet waves. The unfamiliar room, the medical files with my name, the man in the dark coat, and the overwhelming thought that my son was somewhere safe without me for the first time in too long. I pushed myself slowly into a sitting position, my body still weak, but no longer collapsing under its own exhaustion. When I looked toward the door, I expected a nurse or staff member to enter. Instead, it was him. He stepped inside without hesitation, carrying nothing in his hands except a calm presence that filled the room more than any object ever could. He asked if I had slept. I nodded slightly, though I was not sure rest was the same as sleep in a place like this. He placed a small cup of warm tea on the table beside me and sat down in the chair again, not too close, not too far. There was something intentional about the distance, as if he understood that trust could not be forced into existence. I finally asked the question I had been afraid to ask too directly before: why he was doing all of this. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down for a moment as if choosing words that could carry the weight of the truth without overwhelming me. Then he told me that he had once watched someone he cared about suffer because help had arrived too late. He did not elaborate further, and I did not press him. The pain in his voice was enough to stop me from asking anything more at that moment. He continued by saying that when he saw me collapse in that loading dock, he did not see a stranger. He saw a pattern he had promised himself he would never ignore again. A life being drained by exhaustion that no one was stopping. I listened quietly, unsure how to respond to something so heavy spoken so calmly. After a long pause, I asked about Noah again. This time, he slid a small tablet across the table. On the screen was a live video feed. My breath caught the moment I saw my son sitting upright in a clean room, talking softly to a woman I did not recognize. He looked healthier than he had in weeks, his eyes brighter, his posture more relaxed. I covered my mouth instinctively, unable to stop the tears that formed immediately. He explained that Noah had been taken to a private medical facility for observation, not as a patient in crisis, but as someone finally receiving consistent care. I could barely hear the rest of what he said because my focus was completely on my son. Relief and fear collided inside me at the same time. Relief that he was safe. Fear that I had no control over any of this. I told him I did not understand how any of this was possible without my consent. He responded calmly that sometimes survival required decisions made faster than fear could allow. I shook my head, telling him I was not used to people making decisions for me or my child. His expression softened slightly as he replied that he was not trying to take anything away from me, only to stop a situation that should never have reached the point it had. The silence that followed was heavier than before. I looked again at the screen where Noah was laughing softly at something the nurse had said. That sound alone almost broke me more than anything else. I realized in that moment that I had spent so long fighting to keep my son alive that I had never stopped to imagine what it would feel like for someone else to help carry that burden. When I finally looked back at the man in the dark coat, I did not fully trust him yet. But for the first time since everything began, I also could not deny that he had done something I had not been able to do alone. And that realization terrified me more than exhaustion ever had. 2 days passed before I was allowed to leave the room. During that time, everything I thought I knew about my life felt suspended in a strange space between fear and relief. I was no longer collapsing from exhaustion, yet I still felt unstable in a different way, as if the ground beneath my understanding had shifted without warning. Each time I looked at my phone, I expected bad news from work or another impossible demand from reality, but instead there was only silence. Noah remained in the same place, under care I could not see directly, but could verify through brief updates that arrived with careful precision. On the morning of the third day, the man in the dark coat returned again, this time with a simple statement that I would be moving to a different location. I immediately tensed, preparing to refuse, but he raised a hand slightly and assured me that nothing about Noah's situation was changing in a negative way. He said I would only be moved to a place where I could recover properly and be closer to my son when appropriate. I did not respond right away. Trust was still fragile inside me, like something I had dropped too many times to believe it would not break again. Still, I had no strength left to continue living the way I had before, so I agreed quietly. The new location was not what I expected. It was not a hospital room or a hidden facility. It was a quiet residential space overlooking the city, with sunlight pouring through wide windows and rooms that felt intentionally designed for rest rather than survival. There were no locked doors, no guards visible, no sense of being held against my will. Instead, there was an unsettling kind of calm, as if someone had studied every detail of exhaustion and built a place specifically to undo it. I stood in the living area for a long time before sitting down, unsure whether I was allowed to feel comfortable. Later that afternoon, Noah was brought to me for a supervised visit. When he walked into the room, he did not hesitate. He ran straight into my arms with the kind of certainty I had not seen in weeks. I held him tightly, feeling his small hands gripping my jacket as if afraid I might disappear again. He told me he had a room with books, toys, and food he actually liked eating. He said the doctors were kind and that no one made him feel scared. Hearing him speak like that should have brought only relief, but instead it created a deeper conflict inside me that I could not immediately resolve. I looked up and saw the man in the dark coat, standing near the doorway, watching quietly, but not interrupting. I finally asked him directly what all of this meant. Not just the care, not just the help, but the structure surrounding my entire life now. He took a moment before answering, choosing his words carefully again as he always did. He said that what I was experiencing was not charity and not control, but correction of something that should never have been broken in the first place. I told him I did not understand how he could decide what was broken in my life without knowing every part of it. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in my words, but then said something that stayed with me longer than anything else he had said so far. He said he did not need to understand every detail of my past to recognize that no mother should be forced to choose between collapse and survival. After he left the room, I remained sitting with Noah, holding him closer than before. I still did not know who this man truly was or why he had chosen us, but for the first time I began to understand something more important than answers. I understood that my life had already crossed into a place where refusing help was no longer the same as staying strong, and accepting it was no longer the same as losing control. And somewhere between those two truths, I realized my son was finally safe enough for me to start asking questions I had never been allowed the time to ask before. After that conversation, something subtle began to change in the way I experienced each day. Life inside the quiet residential space no longer felt like being held in uncertainty, but it also did not feel entirely like my own life either. Every morning, I woke up to a routine that was carefully arranged without my input. Meals appeared at consistent times. A doctor checked my condition without rushing. Updates about Noah arrived with the same calm precision, never delayed, never unclear. He was still safe, still improving, still under care that I could not have provided alone. That truth was the only thing keeping my thoughts from collapsing back into fear. On the fourth morning, I finally asked to walk outside. The request was granted without hesitation. A staff member accompanied me, but there was no sense of restriction in the way they followed at a distance. The air outside was colder than I expected, sharp against my lungs in a way that reminded me I had not been outside properly in days. I stood still for a long time, just looking at the street below, watching ordinary people move through their lives without knowing how fragile mine had become. That was when I noticed him again. The man in the dark coat was not far away, standing near a parked vehicle across the street. He was not speaking on the phone this time. He was simply observing the building, or perhaps me. When our eyes met, he did not look away immediately. Instead, he gave a small nod, as if confirming that I was stable enough to be outside on my own. It should have made me feel watched, but instead it made me feel strangely protected in a way I could not explain. Later that day, I asked one of the staff members what would happen next. The answer was not direct. They only said that I would be given time to decide what I wanted for myself and for my son moving forward. The idea of deciding anything felt unfamiliar. For so long, every decision I made had been based on immediate survival. Now, for the first time, I was being asked to think beyond that. That evening, Noah and I sat together in a small shared room overlooking the city lights. He told me about the books he had been reading and the drawings he had made. He seemed lighter, as if the weight he had been carrying without words had finally been lifted. I listened to him carefully, realizing how long it had been since I had seen him speak without discomfort. After he fell asleep, I remained sitting beside him for a long time. The silence in the room was different from the silence I had known before. It was not empty. It was peaceful. That was when I heard a soft knock at the door. The man in the dark coat entered quietly, not disturbing Noah's sleep. He stopped near the entrance, waiting until I acknowledged him. I asked him why he was still involved in our lives. It was the first time I had asked without fear in my voice. He took a moment before answering. He said that when he saw me collapse, he did not see a problem that needed fixing, but a responsibility that had been ignored for too long. I told him I was still trying to understand what that meant. He replied that I did not need to understand everything yet, only to know that my son would not return to the life we had before. I looked at him for a long moment and realized something unexpected. I was no longer only afraid of losing control of my life. I was also afraid of returning to it unchanged. Because for the first time, survival was no longer my only goal, and that realization itself felt like the beginning of something I had never allowed myself to imagine. The following morning arrived with a calm that felt unfamiliar to me. as if the world had slowed down just enough for me to notice details I had never had the luxury to see before. I woke up before Noah, sitting quietly beside his small bed in the shared room, watching his chest rise and fall in steady rhythm. For so long, I had measured my life in urgency, in missed bills, in unpaid hours, in exhausted steps from one job to another. But here, for the first time, there was no immediate crisis pressing against my chest. There was only time, stretching forward in a way that felt almost unreal. When Noah finally opened his eyes, he looked at me and smiled without hesitation, as if he had not spent weeks living inside uncertainty. He told me he had dreamed about playing outside again, about going to school without coughing, about not being afraid of falling asleep at night. I listened to every word, realizing how many simple things I had been unable to give him without even knowing how much he had stopped expecting them. Later that morning, I was asked to come downstairs to a quiet office within the building. I did not know what to expect, but I had learned by now that surprises in this new world rarely came with fear attached to them. When I entered the room, the man in the dark coat was already there. He stood near a table with several documents placed neatly on top, waiting until I was seated before speaking. He told me that what had been done so far was not meant to place me under obligation, but to remove immediate danger from both my life and my son's. I asked him again, more clearly this time, what he expected from me in return. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. He said he did not expect repayment in the way I understood it. Instead, he said he expected me to stop living in a way that required me to disappear from my own life in order to survive it. The words were simple, but they landed heavily inside me. I told him I did not know how to live any other way. He nodded, as if he had already anticipated that answer. Then he explained that changes would not happen all at once, but gradually, with support rather than pressure. He placed a single document in front of me, outlining what appeared to be a long-term arrangement for housing, medical care for Noah, and financial stability that I had never been able to imagine before. My hands shook slightly as I read it, not because I did not understand the words, but because I did not understand the life they were describing. After I finished reading, I set the paper down and asked him why he had chosen us specifically. There were countless people struggling, countless mothers working multiple jobs, countless children in worse conditions than ours. Why us? For the first time since I had met him, his expression softened in a way that felt almost personal. He said he did not choose me from a list. He said he saw me at the exact moment I could no longer pretend I was invisible. He said that mattered. I did not know how to respond to that. Silence filled the room, not uncomfortable, but heavy with something I could not yet name. Later that day, Noah and I went outside into a small private garden attached to the building. He ran ahead of me without hesitation, laughing as he touched the grass under his feet. I stood still for a moment, watching him move freely in a way I had not seen in a long time. That was when I noticed the man in the dark coat again, standing at a distance near the entrance, not approaching, only watching to make sure nothing interrupted the moment. For the first time, I did not feel like I was being controlled or observed. I felt like I was being given space to rebuild something I had almost lost completely. And as I watched my son laugh in the sunlight, I realized that the life I had been surviving was slowly turning into a life I might one day be able to actually live. The next morning felt different in a way I could not immediately explain. It was not because anything around me had visibly changed, but because something inside me no longer felt like it was running purely on fear. I woke up early as I had always done, but this time I did not wake up with the immediate pressure of wondering how I would survive the day. Instead, I found myself sitting quietly by the window of the small residential space, watching the city move at a distance as Noah slept peacefully in the next room. For the first time in years, I was not rushing toward a job I could barely endure. I was simply sitting still. A knock came at the door later that morning, and I already knew who it was before I opened it. The man in the dark coat stood there as he always did, calm and composed, as if time itself adjusted around his presence. He asked if we had rested well. I nodded. He stepped inside only after I invited him, which was something I noticed now that I had not noticed before. He never entered without permission. He placed a small folder on the table, but this time it felt different from the previous documents. There was no urgency in his movements, no pressure in his voice, only quiet certainty. He told me that everything we had discussed so far was still available, but nothing would proceed unless I agreed fully and without hesitation. I looked at him for a long moment, trying to understand why someone like him would allow choice to exist in a situation that already felt beyond my control. I asked him what would happen if I said no. He replied simply that nothing would happen. We would leave, and life would continue as it had before the collapse. The answer surprised me more than any instruction he had ever given. For the first time, I realized I was not being pulled. I was being offered something. Later that day, Noah and I were taken to see a doctor for a full evaluation, not in urgency, but in routine care. The clinic was quiet, nothing like the places I had once brought him when every visit felt like a countdown of expenses I could not afford. This time, I did not calculate costs in my head. I did not hold my breath waiting for bad news. Instead, I held Noah's hand as he laughed softly at something the nurse said. When the doctor confirmed that his condition had stabilized and that continued care would keep him healthy, something inside me finally loosened in a way I had not expected. After the appointment, we returned to the residential space where everything still felt unreal but slowly becoming familiar. That evening, the man in the dark coat asked to speak with me alone. Noah was already asleep, so I agreed. We stood in the quiet living area where the city lights stretched beyond the windows like a distant reflection of another world. He told me that what he was offering was not meant to replace my life, but to rebuild the parts of it that had been forced into survival mode for too long. He said I would still make my own decisions, that nothing would be taken from me, and that my son's future would never depend on exhaustion again. I listened carefully, searching for hidden conditions, but there were none spoken. Only clarity. I finally asked him what he gained from any of this. He looked at me for a long time before answering. He said that some things cannot be measured in gain or loss. They can only be measured in whether they are allowed to continue or finally corrected. The silence that followed felt different from all the silences before it. It was no longer confusion. It was choice. That night, I sat beside Noah as he slept and thought about every version of myself that had existed before this moment. The woman who worked 3 jobs. The mother who collapsed from exhaustion. The person who believed survival was the only possible outcome. And then I thought about the version of me that had not yet been fully lived, but was now, for the first time, within reach. In the morning, I signed the document. Not because I was told to, and not because I was rescued in the way I once thought rescue would look, but because I finally understood that accepting help was not the end of my strength. It was the beginning of a life where strength no longer had to mean suffering. When I handed the paper back, the man in the dark coat simply nodded once, as if nothing more needed to be said. And for the first time since everything began, I believed him when he said my son and I were safe not just for today, but for everything that came after.